He stood in front of my grandfather's drivers, men who had worked those routes since before I was born, and told them I didn't have the stomach for the freight business. That I was soft, that I had learned the company the way a daughter learns it, not the way a leader does. 3.5 years later, he sat across from me at a diner booth, 2 miles from the truck yard, with his voice stripped of every ounce of that old certainty, and explained. He never asked, men like my Uncle Glenn rarely do, why it would be good for the family, good for my grandfather's legacy, if I would just come back and help. He never said the word please, but I heard it anyway, and that was almost enough. My name is Sienna Devereaux. I grew up in the back offices of Keswick Transport, a regional freight carrier. My grandfather Earl started with one leased truck and a handshake agreement out of Memphis in 1977. By the time I was in high school, we had 14 company-owned trucks, contracts with 3 university systems, and a fuel depot in Olive Branch that my father had negotiated himself after 2 years of back and forth with the county. I know the smell of that office the way I know the smell of my own house. Motor oil, old coffee, the particular industrial carpet that hadn't been replaced since the 90s. My father ran Keswick for 11 years before his heart gave out in the break room on a Tuesday afternoon in October. He was 53, I was 29. My mother had been gone 6 years by then, so what remained of my immediate family was me, my younger brother Kyle, who was finishing a graduate program in Raleigh and had no interest in the business, and my uncle Glenn, my grandfather's younger brother, who had worked in operations for as long as I could remember, but had always taken orders rather than given them. My father hadn't left a formal succession plan. He'd talked about it over dinner more than once. But he was the kind of man who believed that paperwork was a formality you got around to eventually, not something you did before you needed it. What he left behind was an expectation, understood by everyone in that building, that I would step into operations. I had been working alongside him for 4 years. I knew every major contract, every driver by name, every problem with the Olive Branch depot's drainage we had been kicking down the road since 2018. I was not some outside hire. I was the person he had been training, whether either of us had ever used that word or not. Glenn didn't see it that way. He called a staff meeting 6 weeks after the funeral, while I was still managing the estate paperwork and the insurance filings and every other logistical aftermath that nobody prepares you for. He didn't call me first. I found out the way I found out about a lot of things that fall. Through Blythe, my first cousin Glenn's daughter, who worked in dispatch and had a conscience that occasionally overpowered her loyalty to her father. She texted me the night before. "Dad's doing something tomorrow, thought you should know." I drove to the yard the next morning. Glenn was already at the front of the break room when I walked in, talking to about 14 people, drivers and office staff together, and he did not pause when I entered. He said the company needed steady leadership during a difficult transition. He said that grief was not a business strategy. He said, and I am quoting this as precisely as I can, because these are not the kinds of words you misremember, that I had learned Keswick as a daughter, not as a leader, and that the freight business was not a place for people who couldn't separate emotion from operations. He did not look at me while he said any of it. He looked at the room. I didn't say a word. I stood there for the rest of the meeting, and then I walked out to the parking lot and sat in my car for 20 minutes, staring at the fuel depot sign with the last correction my father had requested. The K needed repainting a shade darker. Still not done. 3 weeks later, the board of directors, which at that point consisted of Glenn, one of my grandfather's old business associates who was 81 and lived in Germantown, and a transportation attorney who had drafted our incorporation documents in 1992 and had never once set foot in the truck yard, ratified Glenn as acting CEO. I was not at the meeting. I was told afterward by Blythe, who had heard through the attorney's assistant, that my name had come up briefly and Glenn had said I needed time to grieve. That was how he framed it. Like removing me from any future consideration was an act of compassion. I left Memphis in January. I took a contract position with a logistics management firm in Nashville, the kind of job that required me to rebuild everything I thought I knew into something I could prove on paper. I got to my transportation operations certificate through a program I finished on nights and weekends. I took a course in fleet management software that Keswick had never adopted because Glenn considered digital dispatch a passing trend. I read court decisions in freight contract disputes on Saturday mornings while my roommate watched college football in the next room. The work itself wasn't hard. What was hard was doing it while knowing that 14 trucks were running routes I could have optimized blindfolded, and that the man sitting in my grandfather's chair had never driven a mile of interstate freight in his life. I didn't call Glenn. I sent no emails fishing for updates. I had made a decision somewhere in those first weeks in Nashville that I was not going to become the kind of person who circles the thing they've been shut out of, making everyone uncomfortable, confirming every word of what Glenn had said about me. If I was going to come back, I was going to come back with something that could not be argued away. I told myself that was clarity. Mostly it was. Blythe called every few weeks, mostly small things at first. A driver had quit. A client had complained about a late delivery. My uncle had hired a new operations manager, a man named Reed Dunbar, who had previously run a freight brokerage out of Cordova and had no direct carrier experience. I listened and said very little. I moved from Nashville to Dallas after 14 months, joining a regional supply chain firm that handled mid-sized commercials accounts across 5 states. My director there, a woman named Holt, who had spent 20 years in trucking before moving to consulting, told me I thought in systems, which she meant as a compliment. I filed it away and kept working. I didn't tell anyone in Dallas that my grandfather had founded a freight company. I didn't mention Keswick once. I was building a reputation that was entirely mine. That was the point. But I was watching. I had set up alerts for Keswick's public filings, for court records in Shelby County bearing the company's name, for contract bid postings from the university systems we served. The first thing that stopped me was a modification to the University of Memphis dining contract, a subcontracting arrangement that hadn't existed in any prior filing, routing a portion of the hauling work through a company called Dunbar Freight Solutions. That was Reed, my uncle's operations manager, billing against the company he was simultaneously being paid to manage. The second was a lien filing from its diesel fuel supplier in Bartlett. Keswick was behind, not 30-day late behind. I didn't contact Blythe about any of it. I didn't want her positioned in the middle of something she couldn't afford to be in the middle of. Instead, I reached out to a former classmate from my transportation program, a woman named Margot Selby, who had gone on to do forensic accounting work for regional carriers involved in contract disputes. I told her what I had and what I suspected. I asked if she would conduct a formal, fully above-board review of everything available through public records. She said it would take time. I said that was fine. I want to be honest about something here, because I think people who hear this kind of story sometimes assume the waiting was easy. It wasn't. There was a night in Dallas about 2 years in when I got a Google alert that Keswick had renewed its Tennessee motor carrier registration, and the filing listed Glenn as sole officer of record. Not even a board designee, just his name. Singular. And I sat with my phone in my hand for a long time thinking about my grandfather at that fuel depot. The summer he had me rebuild a manifest filing system by hand, because he said you couldn't manage what you didn't understand at the root level. I thought about my father showing me how to read a driver hours log when I was 16. I thought about the fact that neither of them had ever once suggested I wasn't built for this. I put the phone down and went to bed. Patience was the only tool I had that Glenn couldn't reframe as emotion. I understood that, so I kept it. Margot's review took 5 months to document fully. What she found, once everything was organized into a coherent record, was a pattern of contract modifications that had redirected somewhere between $1.8 and $2.2 million in freight revenue through Dunbar Freight Solutions over 26 months. It was not outright theft in any way that would be straightforward to prosecute. It was billing arrangements that were technically structured as subcontracts, but should have required board disclosure and didn't. It was a slow and deliberate transfer of company revenue to an entity that Reed owned and that my uncle appeared to have a consulting relationship with, based on financial disclosures connected to Reed's prior brokerage filings. It's mismanagement dressed in documentation. The kind of thing that looks like ordinary business until someone with the right background reads it carefully. And then it looks like exactly what it was. I had been waiting for the right moment to do something with it, and the right moment arrived the way those moments usually do. Without any drama, with a phone call on a Wednesday night while I was eating reheated pasta at my kitchen counter. Blythe was crying before she finished saying my name. She told me that 3 of Keswick's 8 active drivers hadn't been paid their full wages in 6 weeks. She told me the University of Tennessee at Martin contract. 9 years with the company, one of the accounts we had built the Olive Branch Depot specifically to serve, was coming up for renewal at the end of the quarter, and that the university's procurement office had already sent a formal letter asking about 2 late deliveries and 1 missed pickup window. She told me that the fuel line of credit had been reset by the lender to a lower threshold, and that Glenn had responded by reducing driver fuel advances, which meant drivers were covering costs out of pocket and waiting on reimbursement, and that 2 of them had told Blythe privately they were interviewing with other carriers. She was not calling to weaponize against her father. I want to make that clear. She was calling because she was scared for herself, for the drivers she worked with every day, for the 11 people in that building who had nothing to do with any of the decisions Glenn had made. She had watched something she cared about deteriorate in slow motion, and she had run out of places to put it. I told her to get some sleep. I told her I was going to handle it. I did not call Glenn. I drove to Memphis. I went first to the one person I knew would understand what I was about to put on the table. My grandfather's original business partner, a retired man named Wallace Thibodeau, who had sold his stake back to the family in 2003 and had spent the years since then growing tomatoes in Germantown and occasionally consulting for smaller carriers who sought him out. He had known me since I could walk. He had been in the room when my grandfather signed the original incorporation papers, had been in the room when my father signed the first university contract, had sat with me at the back of the church during my father's service, and not said a single word, which was exactly right. I drove to his house on a Saturday morning, and I laid Margot's report on his kitchen table. He read it once straight through. Then he went back to the beginning and read it again. More slowly, his reading glasses pushed down to the end of his nose. When he finished, he set it down with both hands flat on the paper and was quiet for a moment. "Your grandfather would have understood exactly what this is," he said. "I know," I said. He called the board attorney the following Monday. He requested an emergency session on the basis of fiduciary concern, citing documentation he would provide at the time of the meeting. He did not elaborate further. The meeting was held Thursday afternoon at a hotel conference room on Poplar Avenue. I was not invited. I didn't need to be. Margot's report was entered into the record. The board attorney, it turned out, had already received a separate inquiry from the University of Tennessee's procurement office regarding Keswick's contract standing for the upcoming renewal period. By the time the meeting concluded, the board had formally requested Glenn's voluntary resignation as CEO pending a full independent audit, and had authorized the engagement of an outside operations consultant to assess current contract exposure. Glenn came to my cousin Darlene's house 4 days later. Darlene is his older daughter, not Blythe, and I had been staying in her guest room because she had more space, and her feelings about the whole situation were considerably less complicated than Blythe's. Glenn knocked on the front door and Darlene let him in, and then came to find me with an expression that said she was washing her hands of whatever came next. He looked the same as he always had. That was the first thing I noticed. I'd half expected someone smaller, and he wasn't. He was just Glenn. 62, wide-shouldered, wearing the same kind of short-sleeved button-down he had worn to the office my entire life. He didn't sit. He stood in the middle of Darlene's living room, with his arms crossed, and looked at me and said, "You did this to embarrass me." I didn't answer. "You've been watching from the outside, waiting for something to go wrong," he said. "That's what this whole thing was." "I was watching because I couldn't stop," I said. "I spent my whole life in that company. I didn't know how to stop paying attention to it." "You hired someone to go through our records." "Margot reviewed public filings," I said. "Everything she found was already on record. She didn't need a single document from inside that building." He shifted his weight and tried a different angle. "Your father would not have done this." That one landed differently than he expected it to. I took a breath. "My father would have caught the Reed arrangement before it reached $2 million, I said. "And he never would have hired someone with that kind of structure in the first place." Glenn was quiet. Then the certainty drained out of his posture, and he went soft the way I had seen him go soft in arguments with my grandfather when he ran out of ground. Not remorseful, not genuinely changed, just recalculating. "I kept that company alive after your father died," he said, when nobody else stepped up. "You kept Reed's brokerage alive," I said. "The company paid for it." He tried one more approach. He reminded me that my grandfather had always said family takes care of family. He said that the business existed for the people in it, and that I was tearing it apart over paperwork. He said all of this the way people say things when they know the argument is already over, and they're speaking for the record they imagine exists somewhere. You stood in front of those drivers and told them I didn't have the stomach for the freight business, I said. That was a family moment, too. I just wasn't in the room for that one. He had nothing left for that. He stood there for a few more seconds, then picked up his keys from Darlene's end table and walked to the front door, and the screen door shut behind him with the aluminum clap that door had made for 30 years. That was the last real conversation we had. The audit moved efficiently after that. Reed Dunbar's brokerage was removed from all active subcontracting arrangements within 30 days of the audit firm's preliminary findings. 2 of the contract modifications were referred to the board's legal counsel for a contract recovery assessment. Reed's attorney sent a letter threatening a defamation claim and retracted it within 10 days, presumably after someone advised him that public litigation would invite the kind of scrutiny he could not afford. The 3 drivers who had been shorted on wages received the full amounts owed before the audit even closed. That had been my first and only condition when Wallace asked if there was anything I wanted him to communicate to the board. He made sure they understood it as a precondition for any cooperative resolution from anyone connected to him personally. Blythe was promoted out of dispatch into a coordinator role that reflected what she had actually been doing for 2 years without the title or compensation. She called me when it was finalized and cried again, though differently this time. I was glad for her in a way I couldn't fully articulate. Glenn kept his shares. He stopped coming into the building, which was its own kind of outcome. Not formal, not penalized, just absent where he used to be. At Darlene's Christmas dinner that December, I saw him across the room for the first time since her front door. He looked at me and nodded once, the way a person nods when they don't know what else their face is supposed to do. I nodded back. There are things between people that don't resolve cleanly. That particular thing is one of them, and I think we've both quietly decided to leave it where it is. The board offered me the COO position 2 months after the audit findings were finalized. I told them I would accept on 2 conditions. First, that a contract review process be established requiring full board disclosure and approval for any subcontracting arrangement involving a company affiliated with any employee or board member. Second, that an external advisor be brought onto the board within the following quarter. They agreed to both in writing, with a vote behind it, before I signed anything. I drove back to Memphis on a Tuesday morning in February, 3.5 years. The truck yard looked the same from the street. Same sign, same gravel lot, same fuel depot, with the slightly lighter K my father never got around to having repainted. One of the older drivers, a man named Curly who had been with Keswick since my grandfather's time and who had watched me do homework on a truck hood when I was 12, was walking out of the depot when I pulled in. He stopped. He looked at me for a moment. "Took you long enough," he said. Then he went back to what he'd been doing. That was, I think, exactly the right thing to say. My grandfather built Keswick Transport with 1 truck, and the belief that showing up was the whole job. I had spent 3.5 years showing up somewhere else, learning what I should have been allowed to learn at home, and waiting for the moment when what I knew could not be set aside. My uncle once told a room full of people that I didn't have the stomach for the freight business. What he meant, though I don't think he understood it at the time, was that I didn't have the stomach for his version of it. For routing revenue through side arrangements, for hiring familiarity over competence, for the slow trading of my grandfather's name for convenience. That kind of stomach I'm still glad I never developed. The other kind, the kind that reads a public filing at midnight, that sits with a forensic accountant's findings for 5 months until they are airtight, that walks into a truck yard on a February Tuesday and picks up exactly where it left off. I had that the whole time. My uncle just never thought to look for it.